pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, Kathy, roll please.
Carter. Here. Walter.
Here.
Epperson.
Here.
Barstow.
Here.
Sharp. Here. Lee.
Here. Okay, we have a quorum present. Purpose of this meeting, of course, tonight is to discuss the proposed comprehensive plan. First on the agenda is citizens' comments. Anybody wish to speak? Mr. Brush? You know the drill. Name and address.
Yeah.
You got 5 minutes, sir.
Bernie Brush, 5530 Columbia Road, here in Pataskla. I did mention this in the last time I was up here when we were talking about the Mill Street rezoning. One of the tools I thought was great, I've been through, I think, 3 comprehensive plans. But one was to look at what's the ground that's in CAUB, what's the ground in the agricultural districts that you have before the agricultural committee every 5 years. Farms come in to be put in an agricultural district for 5 years, and we had tax maps, or we had maps that would show that and show what was in the agricultural districts, and it helped at least in shaping our comprehensive plan. Also, where do we want to put our utilities? Where's the future growth? One of the key things that we did look at, this is back in late 1990s, was when this AK Steel was looking to come here, and GM before that was providing, where are we going to get the groundwater? Where are we going to get the groundwater resource? And at that time, when they checked it, the most we could get was maybe 4 million gallons, and we had access to maybe 2 million. And we had a study by Dodson Stilson then, and one of the key things they came up with was an up-ground reservoir. If AK Steel came into the JRS site or whatever, because they didn't need potable water, they needed just water to use in the steel industry. That now, that's one of our properties that's zoned by farming 3 generations now. The Hendrons have the Gray Farm, the 300 acres. We even had in the comprehensive plan back in 2000 that was, a great area to protect, at least for long term, because water ends up being what drives development all over, whether you go to the city of Columbus, whether you go to New Albany or anything else. So that's just one thing I just see lacking in this plan, is looking what happened to that and what happened to agricultural land. One of the things on the Mill Street was Doc Coleman's property that he put in an ag for forever with the Department of Agriculture. I also put my farm in with the Licking Land Trust, and there's others out that are waiting to see if they would put theirs in, and they kind of dovetail together to try to keep where's the farmland, where's the floodplain. I have a lot of floodplain. All I noticed is just in the plan that came out, the future has me and John Homan and everything. We're in the mixed use. We're in the apartments and zone. It's kind of like, I don't know, did anyone see what is the current uses and what is the future uses there? And I just don't know why they would propose that. That's just a big question in my head. It's just, I don't see that in the future. If it's not going to get developed, or it can't get developed, it's in a floodplain, why would you zone it village mixed use or whatever for some apartments and dense zoning? It didn't make sense. So that's just a comment that I have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else wish to speak? Ann?
Rogers. I'm at 10932 Mill Street. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. I am also a member of the Planning Commission, if you don't remember that or didn't know that. So I've been a resident for 20 years in Pataskala, and I'm not sure if there's a map available for the one we're considering
Yeah, it
that can be on the screen that I could point out the area.
Dan, could you use the microphone, please?
Oh, sure. Is the microphone not working, or am I not loud enough?
You just need to be closer. Just turn it on.
Closer? Okay. And if you could zoom in on the Columbia Mill Street corridor and the Parkway.
Really hard for me to see from here.
Can you get it further north so it shows all of Columbia as well?
Can you keep going up?
Your, let's see, where the orange area is.
How's that?
That's Columbia there, and then down to Epping Parkway. I think that'll work.
Okay.
I guess. It doesn't show all of, it doesn't, is that to Refugee there at the bottom?
Almost right.
Almost to Refugee, you guys have the idea.
Nothing changes in that color though?
Right. All right, so. Concerning, did I just bump something?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Hold the space button down. Okay.
You wanna move that?
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Great. That's fine.
1 minute left.
I can do it. So, for me, being on Mill Street, and I'm going to approach the screen so that I can show you where I am. Maybe. Alright, so I'm here, and, no, I'm sorry, I'm here. This area here, fine, it's great because it's actually changing back to more of an ag use, which current land use map, I believe, says it's R20 maybe? Yeah. So this is fine, no worries there. This, however, is Columbia. And what we're looking at here, all of this R20, correct? This is the viaduct. You're crossing over a viaduct and you're looking at rooftops, as far as the eye can see, driving up Broad Street. Down here, this is Mill Street. It preferably would be more of the ag use right here. I don't see the logic in this being R20 on Mill. I don't see the logic in this being R20. Coming down, I mean the traffic. This here is currently zoned planned manufacturing, all of this and over to here. So it's improved to some light manufacturing here, but it's really not an improvement. Is it light manufacturing, I think, right here? This
Call it flex.
flex manufacturing, I'm assuming that's kind of like light. So, right now, these are homes. Here is, I think, this is at the Parkway, this is a horse farm here. Okay, so, thinking about the future, when I look at the future of Pataskala in this area, if we keep it the way that map is, we're looking at some very condensed traffic. So I'm thinking maybe nix that plan, keep the orange area there, let's keep that as agriculture, and the Etna Parkway along Columbia, keep that as agriculture as well. There's not much we can do about planned manufacturing on Etna Parkway, since it's already we already have that kind of settled, but I'd like to protect the horse farm, the horse owners. You know, that, I think they've kind of been treated unfairly a little bit. I'm sure they've complained quite a bit about how things have been planned. I don't know personally. Well, I do know that they haven't really loved it, what's been going on, but I haven't spoken with them personally. As a member of the Planning Commission, we do rely heavily on the comprehensive plan and when we make our decisions, and so this is really important. I don't see why we have this heavy concentration in an area that's already heavily trafficked. So I think what they're trying to do is maybe keep it all central, all of the homes central, and then just leave the rest of it, I don't know, open to farms. I don't know. I just don't see the reason for all this heavy traffic. So that's all I have. I do have a neighbor that requested that I read for her opinion.
Hold on just a second, if you would.
Okay.
Ann would like to read something that a resident has given her. Council's pleasure to hear that. Tommy?
I don't have a problem with
Jude?
I don't have a problem with it.
Andy?
it. Nope, no problem.
Mr. Barstow? Mrs. Carter?
It's not a precedent I want to set.
I know, I realize that.
I agree with Mrs. Carter on that issue.
That's fine. I can
No, it's okay.
submit it.
I'm just saying is that it lends it not with necessarily this particular speaker, but it lends itself to abuse. And you can envision
Oh,
how that
I
could
understand.
happen.
It is a signed copy that I could give everyone.
Why don't you do that?
That's fine.
Okay?
That's
Thank you. Yes?
If we're going to accept that as a record, it needs to be notarized.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
All right, will you do that for us?
I can have her do that. I'm sure she'd be happy to do that.
Thank you,
We
ma'am.
weren't sure, that's why I asked.
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank
We-
you.
We discussed it. Thank you, ma'am. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
John Holman, 11015 Mill Street, Pataskla. I first of all want to apologize for coming to this meeting rather ill-prepared. We had been away, and I did not have the time that I normally would take to prepare for a meeting like this. But my draft, which was dated the 7th of January of 2019, and to which I submitted a written response to council on the 7th of February 2019. My draft has our farm, which, as most of you are aware, is encumbered with an agricultural easement, meaning that it must be used for agriculture in perpetuity. But the map that I have has our farm listed under medium density mixed use. My comment is that somebody didn't do their homework when they listed our farm as medium density mixed use. Our farm is agriculture. It will remain agriculture, whether the various elements want to support it as agriculture or not, they will deal with the Ohio Department of Agriculture should they choose to violate the agricultural easement. So, again, I apologize that I have not done a more updated preparation, but those are my comments. Thank you.
Anybody else wish to speak tonight? Okay, moving on to, obviously our new business, discussion of proposed comprehensive plan. I think we'll turn it over to Scott first.
Thank you,
And then-
Mayor.
and then we'll go
Tonight
around-
we have,
We'll go roundy round, for input, okay? Go ahead.
okay, so tonight we have Aaron Dominy with OHM Advisors who assisted us with the plan. He'll do a brief presentation and be available for questions. And we do have some members of the steering committee here available for questions as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Dominy.
Hello again. I'll get that back.
You should have.
I may not want it. So, thank you for having me back, everybody. My name's Aaron Dominy. I'm a principal and partner with OHM Advisors. I'm the principal and project manager on this project throughout the course of the project, even to where we are today. Worked with a number of the folks in the audience on the steering committee through that process. I thought about how to approach this meeting because I've presented to you a couple of times before. And my approach is going to be twofold. One is just to go over a couple of slides, 3 or 4 slides, that really focus in on the purpose of the plan. And then I thought it would be wise to actually walk through it. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to go through the plan kind of component by component to make sure we get all really familiar with what's in there and how it was put together. And then we can do questions. So if that's okay with you, I'm going to kind of jump right into it. As you can see, I have 4 eyes, so be doing this from here is really challenging. Is that full screen, Scott?
It is.
So these are a couple of slides presented to this group before, and I wanted to revisit them. And as some of the comments were coming in, it was actually jogging my memory of why these are important. I think that in many cases, in many communities, when you go through this effort, there can be a lot of misconceptions about what this document actually is and how it's used. And so I thought it'd be helpful just to spend a minute on that. You've seen this before for those of you who've been part of this. The plan is essentially your blueprint, and it says 10 to 20 years up there. I would say your horizon's probably 10 years, knowing how fast this region's changing and how this area is changing. So essentially, as you put together anything, whether it's a car, a house, you're building anything, you have to have a set of plans to get you there. And that's what this document is for the city. The other thing that I think is important to note when we talk about the plan is that as you make decisions as a city, there are really 2 documents by which you make informed decisions from. The first is your code of ordinances, which includes your zoning code, which is a codified way in which decisions are made. And the other way is through reference of the plan. So when you make land use related decisions, those are your 2 tools. Number 1, you always start with the code. Does it comply with the code? 2, you stop at the plan. Does it comply or support the objectives of your comprehensive plan? So that is an important thing to note. In terms of what it is, it does a number of things. It set policy statements to guide future land use and development. I think for this community, that is probably the one area that's getting the most attention and the most focus based on where you are today as a community. Supported by tables, maps, and graphics, and a narrative. The narrative really covering how we put the plan together, everything that went into it, things that we learned, and then key things that drove the decision making. It covers your entire jurisdiction, all elements related to physical development in some capacity. And one of the things that has come up today and even came through one of the comments is, well, what about this and what about that? Especially as it relates to things like water capacity and heavy infrastructure related conversations. And We didn't do a huge deep dive into that. And that wasn't where we started, and it wasn't part of our objective when we got going as part of this. And so we didn't answer all those questions in every detail. So in some ways, this effort doesn't answer all the questions. We didn't do traffic impact studies. It's a whole other effort. We didn't do a thoroughfare plan. That's another effort. So this is really functioning at that 50, 60,000 foot view of your community. I talked about the outlook. It's general, and rather than overly specific, there's a couple of points in this document that actually calls that out repeatedly. And I think that is super important to note here, is that this is a guide. It's intended to be flexible. It's intended to be a guide. It's not a rigid document. And over time, it can be tweaked and updated and amended as needed. But it's not a rigid document, which your code of ordinances is rigid. And again, it's a guiding document. It's not regulatory. So a lot of times when we're at this point and the map gets rolled out, people immediately think, oh, everything's changing. My property's now that when it was this. And that's not the case. The guiding document and the map really sets the tone for if and when things change in the future, this is how the plan or this is how the community would support that land use change. It doesn't mean tomorrow if you were green and the map has you at light orange, now you're light orange. So I think that's really important to note. It does create a unified vision. It's long-term in nature and guidance. I talked earlier about the importance of this document directing public dollars and where you want to make investments in the community, specifically related to your infrastructure or things like your parks and public spaces or what streets you want to improve because they complement some of the things in here. It also does call out in two key areas how to protect valuable resources. And there was a gentleman talking about agricultural land. There's a big part of this plan that is focused on that and identify opportunities to improve quality of life. So those are things like how you get around, where you gather as a community, things that will ultimately add to the value of this place. It does assist with funding, so anytime you chase public dollars, one of the key stopping points is, as you make this request for public dollars, do you have a plan? Is it supported by your plan? Have you done your research? In which case you typically would score more points for having that in place. So that's important to know. And most importantly, it responds to change, which is where this community is at. You guys are in a kind of a change mode, given the growth and development that's happening on the east side of the region and of Columbus. So it was very timely to go through this exercise. So what it is not, and I alluded to this before, this is not your zoning code and it's not your zoning map. That's really, really, really important. I've had that conversation a couple of times through this process, which is why I wanted to be sure to have this up here. It does give direction for how you should or could change zoning though. So there are a number of communities, some right around you, who have gone through this process and then in turn gone and updated their zoning code to mirror or reflect or complement the plan. Doesn't mean everything happens in sync and every color gets changed, but it does give direction for that. Your code is something that's more rigid. It's the answer to all your city issues or elements, so it doesn't do that. I talked about sewer and water and infrastructure, things like that. And it's not intended to be short-term. So this is intended to be kind of a reactive document of what's happening this year, development applications you have in front of you right now. It's really intended to be more visionary and long-reaching. So because it is that, and our crystal ball gets pretty murky after 12 months of what could come before you, it is, a little bit fuzzy, and it's intended to be a little bit fuzzy in places. One of the other points I wanted to stop on here was how do you use the plan? A number of different ways. Number one is to guide future decision making on future development. I know that you're already doing that with the plan you have in place. Inform and guide annexation. So if you are growing outward and annexing land, as land comes in, it should complement what's called out in the plan. Inform and guide rezonings. That's a big one. Set expectations for the private sector. That is super important point to make. When the private sector is out looking to make investment in your community, they want to know what the expectation is, where they should go, what's going to drive some of your decision making as it relates to their application. Provides a basis for decision making for many layers of municipal government. So things like where should you put parks, what types of connections do you want to make, where do you want to have green space. I think most importantly, it calls out what you don't want. And so that's really important to make too. So I want to shift gears now to actually the plan, and I'm going to kind of roll through this and test my eyesight again. I don't know if I can do that. Give me 1 second to get some bearings here. Do you all have a copy of this in front of you? Okay. So I'm going to kind of start at the top here and talk about the mechanics of the document. You have your introduction that kind of sets the table for what the plan is and how to use it. And then you have the plan foundations. So goes through what did we do, how did we gather input as part of the process, and then how did that input actually inform the creation of the plan. We talk about the community identity as a key chapter, land use, which includes a number of factors in there, followed by infrastructure and then implementation. So in the plan overview, the purpose of the plan is called out. Again, some of those key things I talked about in the earlier slides are mentioned in here. The plan being a guide intended to inform what you do, being something that you can measure, and so that is called out in there. How to use the plan, so as a reference point, the slide I just talked about, you can refer back to that in here. We talked about who is involved, the steering committee that was part of this, which was really important to note, that you all, council, appointed a committee to help guide and inform this process. Our job was essentially to be the wagon master of the process. Facilitate the meetings, design the process, bring information to that group, present it for them to make key decisions as it related to how this thing came together. So we didn't make this in a vacuum. There's nothing farther than the truth that we did that in a vacuum. Now, if we were asked for opinions from that group, we would give our opinions and offer insight into certain things that the plan should consider or other things communities have done. In terms of the process, it kind of went through that understanding, which is what is your current context, the engage piece, which was all the engagement we did as part of this effort. We developed the plan and then it was finalized. So on the plan framework, you can see the key elements of the plan listed there with their respective goals, which are also there noted in the introduction. So the next piece was the plan foundations. And so one of the things I wanted to point out here is just kind of how we engaged. We did a number of different things as part of this effort to engage the community. The first was kind of getting out in the community. So we had 3 different public meetings. We had the farmers market event. We had a public open house at a meeting at COTC. We had a 3rd one here. And then we've had 2 presentations to council. We also had a series of smaller focus groups that we ran in this room. So I don't remember how many off the top of my head we did, but we did a half a dozen or so smaller groups of 6 to 10 people that we thought were important to talk to. Those might be big property owners, financial institutions, schools, people like that that had a vested interest in this document or the ability to influence it. And then the last thing we did was a community survey. Your community did pretty good on that. I think we got close to 900 responses to that survey, which informed the development of the plan as well. So just some different examples of the activities mentioned there, presenting the plan as a public engagement process. You'll note at this point in the plan, we talk about some of the data from the survey and some of the things we heard. This is really who responded. The rest of the engagement results, or kind of the so what or what did we learn, is actually mentioned back in each element of the chapters respectively. So we'll bring that information back up as it relates to how the plan was crafted. We also did some technical analysis on your community overview, kind of who you are, where you've been, where you're going. This is just a snapshot of some of that research that we did. Again, the rest of it sits within each chapter. We also took a pretty hard look at kind of where you are today and where you could go into the future in terms of the land use component. This was a point in the process that as a team and at your steering committee actually spent a fair amount of time on. And that was to understand if you grow a certain way, what does that look like? How long does it take? And how have you been growing in the past? So a series of scenarios were developed here for the committee to consider, which is kind of that low, medium, and high growth mode. And they were based on your historical growth figures. So those are building permit data that we got from the city. And so we had the low, kind of what happened during the reception, the high being the good years, when there was something in between, which was that yellow. So we were able to see, by looking at all of the developable land within the community, I think which is right around 8,000 acres. And when I say developable, meaning it doesn't necessarily have a structure on it, it could be potentially developed under base zoning, whether it's an ag zoning or an R zoning. And we did in a scenario where we built out the community and said, if everything continues business as usual, how long does that take? And so you can see some of the results of that, which I thought were pretty eye-opening for the committee to think about and consider as they did their work. This starts to get into the meat of the plan. So this chapter is focused in on community identity. And I'm not going to read this or actually go through every data point, but I will say that a couple of key things came up. Kind of the east side, west side, Old Village, newcomers, and then there was this, that's part of the identity that you're wrestling with. And then the other thing was kind of just being this rural community, which actually means something different to a lot of different people. But I think generally the key theme that we heard there was open vistas, agriculture, more traditional countryside activities, farmers market stands, special events that mirror that. But I think for most folks, this had something to do with having open space, vistas, and some element of agriculture happening here. And so that informed a big piece of what came out of, or what is in the plan now, and 2 specific land use zones. So I know that one of the things that I've already heard from a couple of folks here is that, well, what does agriculture, what does rural mean? And that means something to Andy, and it means something to me, and it means something to Scott. And that's something that the committee thought about a lot too. And so I really want to put emphasis on that, is that there is no strict definition for what that means to everybody in this community. So I tried to capture it a little bit the way I defined it earlier. At the end of each chapter, you'll see there's key findings. And so that was our attempt to say, of all the research that we did, everything we heard, what are the big so what or takeaways as it relates to that topic area? And they're mentioned there. So all the data points before that, together with these, started to drive some of the recommendations in the plan. So you can start to see how the layered effect happens, and you get to a point that drives the recommendations. Each chapter has a goal statement and a series of strategies and action items. So these are the things on an annual basis as you're doing capital planning, as you're trying to make policy change, as you're doing your work as a community, you should reference back to and consider doing. Doesn't mean you have to, but these were things that as a group, the committee felt were important to think about and that would support a lot of the things that we heard and learned. We also supported that with time frame and generally who should be responsible for those strategies or actions. This is a very typical thing you'll see in almost every comprehensive plan in some way, shape, or form. It becomes the implementation arm of the plan. Okay, so each chapter is going to have that. So the land use chapter, I'll spend a little bit of time here, is a chapter that I know is near and dear to everybody's heart in this community. And quite honestly, in almost every comprehensive plan, it is the heart. That future land use map is the one page that gets worn out in every comprehensive plan in every community. So in this chapter, we have things like housing. So you can see there's some results there, what your community felt about different housing types, what you have or what you desire, some trends, some things to think about related to housing trends, and then we have the key findings, and so on. So I'm going to kind of flip through that, and I'm going to flip through economy and kind of get to the land use chapter, now that you understand the flow of the document. I will actually pause in the parks and open space, because this was one area that got a little bit more specific and laser-like focus on it. We were able to work pretty closely with Linear, look at the current conditions of your parks, understand what they needed to support the people that are here today and the future. And they have a pretty specific recommendations in them related to either maintenance or future improvements. So that was a nice kind of add-on into the plan that we were able to weave in there as part of the process. So this should give you some pretty strategic direction, in some ways almost function as a temporary or kind of ad hoc or mock Parks and Rec master plan. Definitely doesn't go into detail as a Parks and Rec master plan would, but there's a lot of good content in here related to each park and things that should happen in each park to kind of make sure that it's maintained and planned for moving forward into the future. One other key point that I want to point out here, which generated a lot of conversation, this was actually at our last council presentation back in January of 2019, right? January 2019?
January 2019, we had the public hearing.
Public hearing. So a lot of folks came out to that meeting and saw this map and were concerned about it. And this is intended to be a very loose guide. And as I roll into the future land use map, the intention with the map, as it relates to creating greenways, is that if and when you have agricultural easements put in place, or there's land dedication put aside to a land trust, something like that, that you work to connect those pieces in your community. So you can create migration corridors both for the wildlife and for people. A lot of communities have done this very well, some in other rural communities like you, and then some in more developed communities in Central Iowa. A lot of communities over in the Darby area are doing this to kind of protect that watershed and connect greenways there. So it's not to say that, and this is where things get confusing for folks who aren't as familiar with these documents. The city comes in tomorrow, takes my property, and without asking, and all of a sudden there's this greenway. That's not the intention. The intention is if and when property gets developed in some fashion, those areas should be connected to kind of create more of a greenway system for the points I made. We also did kind of put some thought to that as it relates to what's actually happening in the environment, from tree stands to wet soils to places that are already protected like parks. So there was some logic in how those huge swaths of green were just dropped onto the map. But it's not intended to be something that creates a taking or something of that to that effect. So this is the future land use map. This is the point you're going to spend a lot of time probably tonight and in the future. I want to say a couple of things here, and that I think is really important to note. If you look at this map and then you look at your zoning map that you currently have, they're not actually terribly different. Most of what you'll see in here, with the exception of a couple of areas, actually mirrors it quite nicely. And there's the zoning maps in the next page or two where you can see that. There are some places where there's some divergence, and that's okay, because we are planning for the future and thinking about where growth is happening and how it's happening and why it's happening there. But I would say for close to 90% of your community, it mirrors it almost exactly. So that's something that it's important to note. The other thing related to this map is that, and it says it in here in a couple different ways, that this is intended to be a guide. It's not intended to be rigid. There's room for interpretation, but it's the starting point from which to make decisions. Try to catch up here with my version. You also notice that it's fuzzy, and it generally follows road lines. It generally follows property lines, but it also fuzzes out and fades out on its edges. That's because we didn't want to put you in a position to say, well, that parcel should be this in the future and that should be that in the future. There's room for interpretation on the edges of how things should be planned in those particular areas. Again, kind of reinforcing the idea that this is a flexible guide, not a rigid document. Okay? As I move through this, I'm actually doing pretty good from this distance working this. So you saw the land use map there on the next page. This is your existing land use, how land's currently being used. So you can see that map. It's part of the research, key findings. Then we kind of start to get into this component. And there's been a couple of questions that have been brought up to me about this. And that is, well, why are we talking about things like intensity of development? And why are we talking about things like setbacks or parking? The reason being that is because if and when you do make a change, whether that's your zoning code or somebody is coming in to try to get a rezoning, you want to have some context as to what your intention is for these districts. It actually gives you some level of protection that you have identified what it is, it has a purpose, and it has an intent with the district. So if and when you did update your zoning code, this actually sets the table for how that can happen. So it's nice to have that in here as it relates to recommended uses and development intensity, so forth. It's a pretty common way to do this, to do future land use planning as part of the plan. These two districts right here are, I think, the two districts that have the most attention, probably from members of the council. I know from folks that I've talked to already or gotten notes from or even heard from today, and that is your conservation rural and your conservation suburban. Those two districts essentially mirror the underlying zoning in terms of development intensity. So the key with them is this, that you're asking folks in the future to protect open space. So rather than develop every 100 acres, for example, in conservation rural with 10-acre lots, you're saying, we want to take that 100 acres, and by right, you may get 10 units because that's the base zoning, but we want you to do it on half that ground. So maybe that's 5-acre lots, and then 50 acres is actually protected as open space, put into a land trust, put into agricultural dedication for the future. A variety of ways to do that. Left fallow to return, that's usually not the ideal situation for a lot of communities, but it is intended to be relatively development neutral. You'll note there is a note there that you may consider as a community giving somebody a density bonus if they protect more open space, if they're protecting significant environmental features, maybe they have property that's key related to getting an easement for some type of future public use. So you have, it does give you some direction and flexibility to have that conversation at that point. But the key here, related back to your identity conversation, and what is said in that chapter, is that this is one of the better tools you can use to try to maintain that rural character. I would argue that 2-acre lots, 5-acre lots across the entire community, number one, is not rural. And number two, is going to put you in a really tough position in the future as it relates to infrastructure. And that's not a place that you want to be. And so this is smart for two different reasons. One, it can protect vistas and open space and maintain that character for you. And two, in the long term, you're developing way less infrastructure. It sounds like a good deal when the developer comes in and says, oh, we'll put the roads in, we'll put all that in, but then it gets turned over to you. Well, now you have to maintain that. Well, in 20 years, what happens to a road? You got to resurface it. The water lines break, you have to do maintenance. That's all on you to do that work, and you know that because you're in the business of doing it now. So if you're developing actually less, it's less infrastructure you have to take ownership of and maintain, and that's a good thing. The only other option to pay for infrastructure long-term is a very unpopular scenario. Nobody wants to talk about it. But ultimately, somebody's got to pay the cost of that. There's a lot of research out there on the kind of the cost of the development and what kind of pays for itself and why. And I encourage you to do some of that research. These two principles here are intended to respond to that and put you in a good position. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day, everything's developed at this crazy intensity. This could be, if you had 100 acres, you could do 5-acre lots, you could do 2-acre lots, you could do 1-acre lots. The smaller the lot at a neutral density, the more open space you get. So it's really that simple. This is very, very, very similar to what is happening on the west side of Columbus right now. Essentially from Grove City up to Hilliard and on through up Dublin in that Darby Accord area. It's something very similar. A lot of communities are also doing, they're outside of the Central Ohio region. We talked about one of them, which is a community I've worked for up in Wayne County, Marysville. There's a lot of communities that are focused on these types of conservation districts. So kind of moving through this document, we have other districts that are defined. I've kind of spent most of my time on those two because I think they'll generate the most conversation. These districts too are intended to mirror a lot of the underlying zoning. For example, if you looked at your zoning map and you saw kind of where that orange is painted, it's pretty similar to what's over there now. Same thing with medium densities residential, with the exception of some areas. There is some change there that you guys should talk about if you have questions or concern about it. This is an area where, significant divergence from what you have now. And there's a reason for that. A couple reasons. One, when we talk about quality of life, creating a center, a place that people want to go, shop, connect, have entertainment, have events, it ultimately comes down to that heart. I live in Worthington, so we have the green. It's our center. And here you have kind of a lot of history. We have these dueling sides and paradigms of what is the center and why is it that. So as we looked at the way the development pattern sits now, this area seemed to be one of the better areas to promote that. To create that sense of a downtown or a town center and kind of have certain amenities here that support people who live in Pataskala. The reason that this area was chosen and identified was it is likely easier to grow that vision here than it is to try to grow it off Broad Street and in an area that already has certain conditions and traits. It's a little unconventional for me to say because as a planner I'm all about trying to revitalize historic downtowns and for a number of reasons. In this situation, it didn't seem to be the right answer. So that is a significant divergence from what you have. It's really called out to be that center. Also, the mix of uses that are called out in here, many of them can be economic income generators for the city of Pataskala, which is a good thing. So that allows for a mix of uses, allows things for like law firms, real estate, offices, dentists, doctors, those kind of smaller office uses that would really generate revenue for the city, and that's really important. Neighborhood commercial, so these are smaller nodes where the plan says, commercial could be viable here, we could support that here, but it's at a significantly smaller scale. So these are small uses, whether they're convenience stores or a small CVS or something like that. That's really intended to serve the people around that area. And then the last district over here is community commercial, which is essentially what you have now in that spot, which is more of a regional shopping center. Two other districts, Flex Industrial Innovation. Again, for the most part, many of these areas mirror what you have now. And I think your committee also recognized that these are super important to the economic sustainability of your community moving forward. You're already getting pressure in some of these areas. You're seeing the growth happen. These were the areas that were identified to continue to support that growth if and when it happens. Again, the key is if and when. Doesn't mean tomorrow you go out and change the zoning, take everybody's property, and that happens. This happens organically over time. Last one is just public park space, open space. This is essentially your existing park space. So, like the other chapters, a series of goals, statements to support the future land use map, and then the principles therein. The last chapter was infrastructure. So I would say of the chapters, admittedly this one had the lighter touch. We didn't go deep into understanding capacities now and in the future and really studying your thoroughfare system. Some of those are bigger lifts that require deeper analysis that we did not do. We did, I would say, the windshield analysis on these two sections. And I think it's a good starting point. Now it's up to you guys if you want to do a deeper dive and really take that plunge and really study those systems in greater detail. So we looked at ADT, we looked at the existing system, kind of active transportation. There's a lot of best practices that are mentioned in this section as well. So it really did consider both motorized and non-motorized from that standpoint. And then it did give a really cursory, high overview look at different roadways and how to create a certain amount of character on them. Again, this is beyond the 4-inch paintbrush. This is the paint roller. but you have work to do here, okay? For example, I'm working with Westerville right now on Africa Road from Polaris down to Main Street in Uptown. And we're doing a detailed study on that roadway character. So that is a whole other effort in and of itself. And that's probably something you guys would have to undertake in the future to further uncover what you think the vision should be for these different roadways. I think this plan does enough to say, we value these roadways, we value the vistas and the experience traveling through them, because that also creates your character. What you see from the windshield of your car is a big part of who you are. So we wanted to be sure to say something rather than nothing here about that topic. So let's see here, where are we? Talked about infrastructure. There is some analysis in here, some work that was done to look at these facilities. Water service. Some of that we relied on your team to kind of feed us information, and then we kind of, again, touch on best practices in there as well. And then the same pieces of the puzzle at the end. Now, the implementation section is essentially all of that condensed down into one table. So that's just a nice way to say, on a daily basis, if you just want to look through the matrix and understand what was said in which chapter, it's all put together at the end there. So that is almost 2 years of work brought back to you in about 30 minutes. So hopefully I did a good job of kind of summarizing it all for you, reorienting you to the document for those of you who've seen this. And for those of you who are new, welcome to the journey. You've now understood what happened over the last 1.5 to 2 years to get to where we are. So at this point, I'd be happy to take questions. My intention today is to kind of hear what you have to say, take notes, and then I think you as a group have a decision either tonight or at some other point in time to determine where you go from here.
Mr. Lee, do you have anything?
Yeah, Lou's gonna go round and round.
Well, I think
I
that.
don't have any specific questions for him, I've got some comments for him. Sorry.
Any questions for the gentleman? Okay, we'll start with comments then, we'll go round and round.
All right, well, first, I wanna thank the committee for all the time and effort that they put in. See, Amy and Brenda there, I know not everyone's here, but I know you guys put a lot of time and effort into this, and, it, doesn't, go unnoticed, and it's greatly appreciated, so thank you guys. I've just got a few comments. I've spent a lot of time on this in the past month, with Scott, and, just reading it, and going through it. I do have some issues with the future of the land use map overall. I think that it's okay. To be brief, a couple of my issues are just the flow of it, the way that it changes so drastically. There's no kind of in between, and I think that can easily be resolved. I also think that I couldn't tell if there was consideration for utilities, where certain utility lines, water and sewer and all that was. I did notice as well, Mr. Holman, he brought up a good point about how his farm's marked, just little things like that, so I'm not gonna go into detail on that. But I do have issues with the future, map. The other thing, after talking to Scott, and no fault of his, and I think it was more direction from the previous administration, but I don't know that Scott and the Planning and Zoning Department got to really weigh in on this as much as we thought. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you more facilitated this.
That's correct.
You didn't really have any input on it. Maybe a little bit, but not a lot.
I viewed it from my perspective was that I'll facilitate the process, and if there's technical questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. I attended every meeting, but it's the community's plan, not my plan.
Okay.
So I let the community, steer the direction we went.
So with that being said, some issues with the future map. I know we talked about where do we go from here, and I have kind of talked with Scott on this. I just want council, I want to hear what everybody has to say, but I think that moving forward, that maybe we take a two-phase approach on this, and we've already got phase 1 done, which is probably the most important, which is community input. And I think that phase 2 would be take it back to development committee and get input from our planning and zoning and take it up that way. and then just take what they've done and kind of just go back and match it up with other maps, see how it compares, get planning and zoning input. So, those are my concerns, and that's kind of my thought moving forward,
Mhm.
so.
Okay, thanks.
I will, pass it over to John.
I don't have anything specific at this time, I'm still studying it, so.
Okay.
Andy?
Okay. Let Andy laugh.
Well, I've got a couple questions for you, Aaron, and then one of the things I guess I wanted to point out, one of the things you mentioned tonight, after every section there's key findings and recommendations. So one of my biggest questions is, if those key findings and recommendations aren't followed, and they're not revisited, such as you had mentioned when we're going through budgets and so forth and infrastructure, if they're not followed, let's just say 99% of them are not followed, is this comprehensive plan valid? And I mean it from one viewpoint only. Everybody goes back to the future use plan. They always quote it. It's used when staff recommends something or says, hey, the comprehensive, I shouldn't say it that way. It doesn't recommend, but they always quote it. They always say this is either in conformance or it's not in conformance with the future use plan. Well, the question I have is, this is a comprehensive plan. So there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of recommendations in here. If none of them are followed, 99% of them are not followed, and the only thing that they pull out of this plan is the comprehensive, or the future use plan, is this comprehensive plan valid?
I mean, I would say yes. There's plenty of plans out there where the plan's is only good as the leadership and the folks that have it and how they use it. So that's a question I always get, well, when does a plan fail? And I would say, when it's turned over and people have to actually use it and follow it and kind of massage it.
So you don't think it fails if the recommendations, such as open space, or, you give a great definition of rural character. Let's say that none of the future uses per se represent a rural characteristic. Don't those have to be utilized together for the future use plan to be valid also? Because one can't be valid without the other, right? I mean, that's what I'm getting to.
I'm not following you 100%. If
Okay.
you're not following everything in here.
Not everything. I'm saying if you're not even following the majority of it, how can the future use, how can one piece be valid and relied upon? We heard from one of our esteemed members of planning and zoning, and they stated, and clearly I've heard it, I've been to many meetings where they rely on it very heavily. Does it comport with the future use plan, yes or no? And it says yes. Okay, well then it's already has a disposition of being something that the plan says is what the vision shows, right? Just because it falls into the future use plan. But if you ask 9 other questions, none of those other questions follow the comprehensive plan. But those are never brought out. Those are never stated. We never talk about those things. That's what I'm getting to. And I have another question to follow up for you. But that's my question for you is, I know that case law says that, the future use plan is a valid legal document, and courts rely upon it, correct?
They do.
Okay, so that's the danger I get into, especially when, and this is the other piece that I wanted to bring up. You stated that by your own admission, and I know that this was true just by being at different meetings, the steering committee, yourself, others, really looked at this from an 80,000 foot level, right? So while, we did that, we're saying this plan doesn't take other things into consideration per se. It doesn't take utility locations into consideration. It doesn't take traffic situations into consideration when it makes these recommendations for future use. It doesn't take future school needs into consideration, so forth and so on. Soils, doesn't take soils.
But I wouldn't say that's true.
Okay,
We did
but
consider mobility, we did consider infrastructure.
when you say mobility, you didn't look at traffic congestion. You looked at,
We looked at the average daily counts, and so.
you got one page in here. You got not even a whole page.
Correct.
So okay, I don't want to get in an argument, I'm asking the question, that's what I want to make sure. This guidance, this book in general, with the future use plan, provides preferences. It states that. These are preferences of our community.
Mhm.
shouldn't this guidance be clearly stating that this was an 80,000 foot level look? We didn't look at huge pieces of details. And we have a statement in here that says, if a zoning request doesn't fall within this comprehensive plan, it should be strictly looked at. It should basically looked with great scrutiny, because it doesn't fall within this.
Right.
Well, I have a real problem with that. If they don't know, if that future zoning board or council or whomever doesn't know that this wasn't really looked at per your own, I mean, and we all know this,
Right.
that, you know, the utility details weren't looked into in the greatest detail. The future infrastructure plans weren't looked into with the greatest detail. So we're making decisions on something that was an 80,000 square foot or 80,000 level look, and we're saying we gotta follow this with great scrutiny, and if it's not, we should be questioning it hugely. I think that's my issue
Okay.
with the details that you give on that one sheet that say, hey, these should be 2 stories, or this should be so much square feet, or this density should be followed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it may be completely different than that, because we didn't look at those details, such as soil types. You know, well draining soil should be developed, well, I'm not gonna say that, because Dr. Holman will get very mad at me, but, you know, well draining soils should have a preference to develop versus non-well draining soils, right? I mean, that's just kind of a given.
I hear what you're saying.
Okay. So that's kind of my question is, can this document reflect more along the lines of that type of understanding? So the future reader of this understands that this was not, it should not be, as Ann had said, Ms. Rogers had said, you know, the Planning and Zoning Board looks at this and they take this with a huge weight. This is definitive for them in some cases. And I just worry, that's one of my worries. Is there a way to make this plan work in a manner that reflects that? So instead of saying, this point right here on the map should be X, or is there a way to say, hey, this is an area we want to develop, this is an area we don't want to develop. We're not saying exactly how to develop, but these are kind of zones where we want to target development in a way. That's where I'm getting to.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I know you've probably done them that way before. I've seen a couple of yours that do that.
Yeah, and there are number one, the state of Ohio doesn't require any level of analysis as part of a comprehensive plan. It's actually very vague in terms of what it says it must go into a plan. So this is far and away more than enough that, based on how our state looks at comprehensive plans, content-wise, is comprehensive. I would believe this would be determined comprehensive. And there are other communities who have plans like this that work them and they work okay. To understand where all the utilities are, to fully do future traffic impacts based on build out, is a huge undertaking. And I would say most of the times those things aren't analyzed to the 10th degree as part of these efforts. There's been one that I've been part of recently in the last 15 years, which was Hilliard, Ohio's plan. It was a full Parks and Recreation plan. It was a detailed thoroughfare plan. It was a comprehensive plan, and there was market studies done. I mean, that was a big effort, but that was something they wanted to do, and they wanted to go that far as part of that analysis. So there are ways to do that and get that comprehensive. I don't think you're in jeopardy because we haven't mapped all the utilities and we don't know all the traffic impacts. That's where on your Planning and Zoning Commission, you have to make an informed decision based on a variety of information. It's not just what's in here.
But you're
sure.
getting right to my point. I appreciate that, Aaron, because that's exactly my point. It doesn't say that in here.
Well, we can make it say that.
Exactly. So that's one of my points. That's I think a really important part of this is to say, hey, future 10 years, and I agree with you. This is a 10-year plan. I agree with you 100%. 9 years from now, when we're not here, or somebody else has come in here and are reading this, they hopefully will understand that there are these other enormous items that could have changed in the last 5 years that aren't in this plan. Don't take this as definitive necessarily. Take it as a case by case. And I'm going to say, well, I want to, because I want to move on because everybody's got questions.
Excuse me. I just hang on. I mean, that's my concern. That is Mr. Walter's concern is not necessarily from the same
because I don't do land use law, I don't practice that area, but, that's the same concern, is that this is somehow will become, the Bible with a small b, for future, councils or planning and zoning, like, oh, we have to go with this. What you just talked about, the flexibility, it's, I don't say notional, but it's flexible, it's proposals, it should say that in here, and it doesn't. I mean, it looks, and it makes it look like, what I don't want people to get the impression is that it should be, you look at this land use map, I think it should be a little bit more explicit that this is.
I even considered renaming it. So one of my items, I think you saw on my list, was rename it to something else.
Sure.
If I could,
Can I comment on that real quick though? Because I do want to point out that it says it a number of different places in here. Most importantly, it says it on page 86, where it says these descriptions are intended to be a general guide for how development may occur in the future, not a rigid set of standards. So
can we put that on bold text right here on the
it's on
future
the
use
page,
plan?
it's on the page before it.
I know, but they don't, Aaron, you know as well as I do, when there is a statement made by the zoning department, saying that the staff says, this either agrees or doesn't agree with comprehensive, they don't say, but this plan is only a guide and so forth and so on. I just wanna make sure we're all clear on that.
It's an easy change to,
Perfect.
to say.
The other
it
thing I
somewhat
wanted to
differently.
clarify with you was, you said this mimics the underlying zoning. Well, I fully agree with you, and I went through and I looked specifically to that issue. The only issue I have with that is, while this mimics the underlying zoning, this plan says the city prefers it stay that way, whereas the underlying zoning just says that's what it is now. There's a huge difference between those two things. When you look at this comprehensive plan, there's got to be meat to say why should it stay this way, rather than the underlying zoning just says, well, that's what it is. That's what it is today. That's the differential, I think, between the comprehensive plan and the underlying zoning. And I feel like there's still, I'm going to agree with Mr. Lee, that there's still work to be done with this. And I think you and I have had this discussion. There's work to be done to make sure that this thing has those reasonings behind it, and that meat behind it to say, this is why this preference is this and this. And I wanted to, would you agree with that? I think you would.
Well, I don't know.
Maybe 50%?
Again, that's why each chapter kind of ends with the key findings. And so if you look at those key findings, they should translate directly into the recommendations that are in the matrix. So that was the intention of why we did that. A full justification and analysis, it may be what you're asking for, and we can certainly take a different approach or different look at that. But that was the intention.
Again, Aaron, I don't mean to sound like I'm just critiquing the heck out. I'm not. I think there's a lot of great work in here. I think there's a lot of great public involvement, and I'm going to echo Tommy that says the steering committee worked very hard with you. I know they did. They spent a lot of time and effort. But I do want for one more thing for my fellow council people. One of the quotes from BJ King, our previous administrator, on January 2nd, 2018, he sent us an email. And he said the comprehensive plan would include not only land use considerations, but also analysis of our utility capacities, transportation systems, population growth, housing, etc. Which I agree with you. There is some of that in here. The next part is the important part. This will be an overall look at the city, not just land use analysis. I feel doing anything short of a comprehensive study of the city would not be beneficial to us in the long run. So I think we've got a lot of good meat, and we got a lot of good tools here, but I'm going to agree with Tommy that there's a lot of pieces that I think could be brought together with the assistance of the administration, with planning and zoning,
Yep.
with a lot, because I've got 2 pages of questions, which I'm sure nobody wants to hear. I don't.
I mean,
So,
you can continue to work this and dive deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper to make it as comprehensive as
I think it
possible.
can be great,
Yeah.
quite frankly. I really do. And I've got some big ideas that I'm going to pose when we get to that point, but not here, not now. Because I think there's some great ways to make this truly Pataskala. That's all. You're welcome.
Mr. Barstow.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, no, I mean, first of all, I know that the steering committee and everyone involved worked really, really hard to do this, and I think has a lot of good ideas. But I still think it needs to go back through, but I agree with Tommy, and Tommy and I have talked about this a little bit. I think it does need to go back through development and so let us put our own, more of our own mark on it. Not that the steering committee, who's made up of residents, didn't. I just think it just, this is a big, undertaking, and as we've seen in the last year, the amount of development requests and development that's happening in the city is really, the pace has been pretty, more intense than I think that I thought it would be, certainly in my years on council. So, but I wanna reflect on something. I mean, we talked about these, I'm on page 79, and we're talking about, and Mr. Brush touched on this, where, near where he lives, or where he's living on Columbia, that would become, I think Mr. Brush said village mixed use. I think it's medium density mixed use.
That's correct, apartments.
So, you know, the other day, I had a doctor's appointment in Gahanna, so I drove down Columbia, drove right by where Mr. Brush lives, and, farther west, there must have been half a dozen for sale signs, on Columbia Road, for properties on Columbia Road offering larger tracts of land. So it's changing. I'm not so sure it's gonna change into, as Mr. Brush just said, permanently pick it up into apartments, because that's something that I'm completely opposed to. So that's my concern, is some of these future land uses are things that, at least this current council, I know just from hearing the discussions and talking to council members and being at the meetings, are not in favor of. So that's the other concern that I have, is that,
Could you point out for me, Scott, on the map where we keep talking about?
oh, I'm
It's
sorry.
the orange, I'll stand. I'll show
Yeah,
you.
Mr. Brush will help.
It's pretty easy. They just targeted me and John, we're the ones that put all our land into ag easements. This is all John down here, he's completely across here and down here. I'm up here, we got Hendrons here that bought 300 acres here, it's the third generation, they wanna keep it that way. Why would you make, this area all, it says multi-family, 6 to 10 units an acre, and it's in floodplain. It's beyond comprehensive.
Well, again, it doesn't mean that whole area gets developed out and we develop in the floodplain and we do all those terrible things, right? That's not what this means. It just means, that's not what this means.
Well, what the map says, I mean.
Well, you have to give it some type of designation in the future.
I'm
right?
just,
So,
well,
it doesn't call out every ag easement in the entire city, and it doesn't show all the wet soils, hydro soils.
sure.
Because it's intended to be just broad and visionary, and rather than getting down to that level.
Right, I guess my, again, that's my concern, is that we have these ag easements, and again, land use is not my area, so, my concern would be, is that we designate this as medium density mixed use, which contains these, permanent agricultural designations, and then a future council, not this council, but a future council decides that, well, we don't care, and I think this would be a horrible idea, we don't care about these permanent ag easements, we think that the better use, is apartments. And it's the comprehensive plan says apartments, or medium density mixed use, which, that's a nice way of saying apartments to me. And so we don't care about these agricultural easements. Sorry, Doc Holland, sorry, Mr. Brush. We're gonna go in a different direction. So that's my concern, is that we need to get a little bit more specific. I think that was Annie's point on some of these areas that the ag easement. I'm probably not using the right word, but I think you know what I'm talking about. That's an example. So those are
But in
my
that, I
concerns.
just want to point out, especially for the people in the audience, that can't happen. Once something has a dedicated easement on it, you can't just make it pretend that it doesn't exist and it goes away. So those areas would continue to be protected, they would have their easements, and they would maintain the way they are.
Why would you put them in orange then?
Hold on,
Come on
Yeah,
now.
one of the things that I would point out on that, and I think this is where Todd may be going, is, well, you've got an easement on top of certain acreages.
maybe it's good to identify the acreages directly adjacent to those acreages as your target conservation areas, so that future apartments and so forth don't get built right up to the ag easement, and those that don't have
Sure.
the ag easement, that would be the reason why I would look
Sure.
at it, is to say, these are targeted conservation areas, whereas maybe something next to flex industry probably should be more, could be more useful, not useful, but could be more identified as future development as maybe medium density, because it makes sense a little bit more next to a flex industry, where you might have some smells, and you might have some other things.
So two thoughts on that real quick. One, that's getting into code, right? So when we talk about those setbacks and those buffers, that is gonna be in your zoning code, not necessarily in this document. But I think this area in particular, of all the areas in this document, the one area that I think, based on what I hear you all saying, deserves conversation is that area around the town center. And the converse is that mixed use area around the town center that we were just talking about. And part of the original discussion when that was created was that if you're going to have a center of activity, you're gonna also need some things that support and drive that center of activity. So that was just a function of kind of economics and really understanding what you could create there. It certainly could be smaller, it could go away. And the plan functions fine without it. So that mixed use area around the town center, you know, you could do a variety of different things with that. And I hear you guys saying that's one place that you probably wanna go back and really think about.
Anything else, Mr. Barstow? Right now?
Well, I mean, if the town, I think the town center is gonna be at Columbia and Broad, I don't think that's an appropriate place for it, because we just talked about, the town center would be better suited a little bit farther east, 310 and Broad, which is already sort of, the area has that sort of use, it has the trafficking in the intersection already there, so that's.
So, Mr. Barstow, we talked about that, and the likelihood of having somebody assemble all the property there that's already pretty well developed, and functionally change how that area is working today. And the fact that it's farther east and you're already dealing with these issues of kind of the east and west, old versus new, and you have government facility here, which tends to be the heart of a lot of these different types of town center developments. That's why this area generally was identified as that place. I just wanted to give you the backstory and understanding of how it ended up there. It wasn't just pulled out of thin air by the group.
Well, I wasn't suggesting it was, I'm just suggesting that, I'm saying is that the problem is, it's the same problem here as it is down at 310 and Broad. There's already something going on there, whether it's a restriction based on restricted agricultural use or property that's already developed. By the way, the property at 310 and Broad on the northwest side's abandoned, not abandoned, but it's for sale, nobody's using it, so just FYI. That's my 2 cents, thanks.
Mrs. Carter?
I have a couple of thoughts. As we were talking and he was reading some of the emails from prior administration, I remember when we first went into this process and council had a lot of questions about how to approach a comprehensive use plan, why our own, folks couldn't do it, and we were all a little reluctant to sign on to paying for something that we didn't really understand what we were getting. At least I didn't. And so I did come to a few of the meetings and watch the process and saw the amount of work and research and detail that went into it. My thought is it's a great starting place, but it definitely needs us to take a deeper look and fix some of the areas that we, have already been pointed out. My question would be, Scott, if you felt like you were, just kind of overseeing things, and you had input to give, what would that be?
That's a pretty broad question to get into now. It's just different development types, that what I feel might be appropriate development types from what we've seen with plans coming forward don't match.
Right.
So from my perspective, I said, no, it needs to be this, then we get to council, and clearly that is not what council wants, then I'm not working for the community, I'm putting too much of my input in that it's not doing the best for the community, was what it should do. That's why I just stood back, facilitated, answered any technical questions, and let the residents, via survey, via steering committee, have the most input.
Well, I guess what I'm looking for is, you know, because we have residents who've lived here some their entire lives, who, you know, have a great deal of information to give about the history of the city and things of that nature. So what I'm looking for is your perspective from, you know, zoning and what you do, and coupled with input from the community to what makes sense. Because those are, you know, things from your perspective aren't things that I necessarily understand all the details of. So I need those two things together to help it make sense. I mean, I know just overall looking at it, you know, some of the things that I disagree with, some of which have definitely already been pointed out, and I've said this before, but I see it a little differently than Mr. Barstow. I feel like if we leave our town center down here, then we just continue with the same problem we've always had. And it looks to me like, I mean, a little cynical, but same old, you know, here we go, this is it, it's the same. It's all centered down here, this is where the activity is, and the people on the west side of town will continue to go west for all their services. Shopping, gas, whatever their needs are, because it's not convenient to come this direction to do that. So I think at this point, this is a fantastic start, but we just need to dig a little deeper and make adjustments according to what we already, you know, what our experience has been, some guidance from administration, in addition to what we have.
Mr. Epperson?
Thank you for the presentation.
Sure.
Appreciate that, very informative. Couple notes, the public input in this is fantastic. I'd like to see more on that. If we do circle around and come back to this and reapproach it, seeing just, you know, where residents feel things and growth should be. I feel as council, we represent the residents, and their input is greatly important to me. We did kind of touch on it a little bit with the process of why Columbia and Broad was chosen. Would anybody from the committees that are present have any input as to their thoughts on that area? On kind of how it came about, why it doesn't, I mean, because to Ms. Carter's point, I think the more we keep pushing things east, I don't think is quite right when we're trying to merge the city as a whole from east and west. So some sort of center, you would think would be center. So I'm just curious as to.
And if there's a member of the committee that wishes to speak, please come up to the podium so we can all hear you.
I'm just curious as the process, because maybe if that place, Broad and Columbia, isn't the right spot and someplace is, kind of what was the thought and input went into that, so we
Go
can look
ahead,
at different areas.
I'll add to yours if you.
But if you don't remember, because it's been a while, that's okay too.
I think do it. Ann Walther, member of the steering committee. One of the keys
Address,
about
please,
this-
ma'am, just for the record, address, please.
7899 Columbia Road.
Thank you.
So when the committee looked at the center, and this was a big topic, if I recall, on our questionnaires and on the interviews that occurred, where would you put the community center? And somewhere in the document is a dot of the results of that.
Your memory's better than mine.
And so what we did is they did dots, you know, put the dot on the map of Pataskala. And there was a conglomeration around Old Town, but then predominantly those that were from the west side, because that was part of the die matrix that we used to capture who was from where. They didn't put the west side. They didn't put Circle K or what's the strip mall there,
Dougie, anything like that. They didn't put any of that there. Instead, they put City Hall. So when they thought about the center of the community, it seemed to be driven towards City Hall. Although I can tell you, if you look in the comprehensive plan, many didn't think we had one. There was an element that said we don't have one. Some said we had two. And then some didn't know. Like they had no idea, like there was no comment. So there is some rationale. So for the committee's view, and correct me if I'm wrong, Amy and Brenda, we tried to juxtapose what we thought would work as a center. I can say from my perspective, my blue, my personal blue did not stretch over to Columbia Road, simply because of Dr. Homer's property. And because Columbia Center, to me, historically, represents more of a historic area. There is a element of the Pony Express. There's a couple businesses there, now there's some of the homes around it, albeit they're multicolored, but they are historic in nature. You can research that if you want, or you can ask me. But so my center essentially ended right here, like by Conway Village. That's where I would draw the line. So in my review, I've actually said, hey, we need to enlarge this and look at it from a standpoint of how it would mesh there. But on this document, yes, it does take it all the way out to Columbia Center. So did I answer that right? Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, with that said, in the blue areas identified, the way they were identified, the medium density mixed use, is that something that's common around those areas in other locations? And is that potentially the reason why those areas were identified as that medium mixed use?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Also, I find the key findings in each section very helpful. It kind of, I mean, this is a plan for the next 10 years, and what's interesting to the residents and the people and the key findings of those areas is important to me. But I do believe a deeper dive is needed, especially with regards to infrastructure and infrastructure impacts. There's only so much money to go around. Budgets only go so far. And if we're going to spend money in areas, I believe we need to be spending money in the correct areas that's going to fall in line with the comprehensive plan. It's going to grow those areas. If whether it's Columbia Broad or it's Minkin Broad or wherever, in the future it's decided that an area like that needs to be, I think that definitely needs to be looked at, and the impacts and infrastructure impacts need to be looked at, and I think we all need to have some consideration of that before we spend the dollars in certain areas and on certain things. Also, to the point of a town center, I think in speaking to a lot of people that I know and have come up to me since gaining this position, a lot of people talk about areas like, why don't we have like a Creekside, or why don't we have like in Johanna, or why don't we have, X, Y, and Z that's in different other cities and towns. And being new to this and learning how to approach this is very educational to me. So hearing the input of the residents and why they think we need kind of a center area is kind of important, and I don't want us to just gloss it over because maybe the location on the future use map, it maybe isn't correct. Correct it, maybe a different area would be more suitable, but I definitely think it's something that we need to look at going forward. So thank you for your time, everyone.
Any final comments? Any final comments from you, Mr. Fulton?
I've heard two, Mr. Lee and Mr. Barstow indicate that they'd like to see the plan go back to Development Committee for further consideration. So if we could get a consensus of if that's how we want to move forward, then I'll take it from there and we'll get it to Development Committee and start hammering out some of these details.
Is that the consensus?
I don't know if we need a motion or just.
I don't think we need a motion, we just tell them that's the direction we'd like to head in.
I mean, do we have like any areas of targeting concern? I think.
I was gonna ask, if council does have consensus on that, as the chairman of that committee, what I was gonna ask was, if everybody could send it to Scott, your thoughts. Put it in an email, write it in paper, hand it to Scott, whatever. But if each council person could take some time, I know we're all busy, and get exactly what you're saying to us, we will look at every single concern, and hopefully we can get it taken care of. Also, one thing I didn't mention when I was talking about input from planning and zoning, I don't wanna procrastinate this, but I'd also like to get input from whoever the new city administrator is. I think that, whoever it is, their opinion's important in this, so. Whoever the new city administrator is.
Okay.
I don't wanna wait that long, but I think we can start before that. But
And also point out, we only have a 2-member development committee.
it's true.
So we have a few.
I don't think, I think,
Is Mr. Hicken on the development
Jude's
committee?
got it.
it is,
It's me and you right
yeah, it's you, me, and Andy.
now.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Special-
I thought it was 10.
No,
Okay.
You're thinking utility,
Utility, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, please, if you could send us, obviously the three of us will be on it, but
Yeah.
send us your thoughts.
Mr. Walther?
I'm gonna echo something Mel had mentioned also. You know, I think it's also important not only for planning and zoning, but for the police department, for utilities, and for maybe even, this original intent was to bring in some other stakeholders, such, I know just talking with you, Aaron and Scott, you know, the schools didn't put very much into this. They didn't give us a lot of input. Matter of fact, it was, Scott, I don't wanna quote you, but it was
Minimal.
well, it was hard to understand what their input was. How about that? How's that? Hard to decipher. So we need to get them more involved, because every time a new zoning comes to us, it is absolute, without question. We are going to get comment from the schools, one way or the other, usually the other. And we've got, as Aaron mentioned, there's 8,800 acres of undeveloped property here. Could be potentially 11,000 plus resident units. That's not residents, that's resident units. And I think there's, it's like 11,000 plus of that. That's what the existing zoning allows. And there's a matter of viewpoint of how much time that's gonna take. But, you know, with development pressure, that could take a lot less time. I think you said by 2040, it could be developed out. I think that's the quote in here. So there's a lot of concern with making sure that our roadmap is right, you know. As I say, you know, our flight plan is right, so that we know where the plane's going. So,
The 11,000 was additional residents, not residential units.
not residential units?
No,
Okay, all right,
residents.
residents,
Yep.
sorry, I misspoke.
So by
Residents.
2040, high growth, you would have 4,400 additional units
Residential units,
with 11,000 people.
11,000.
For moderate, it would be 2,600
All right,
units.
very good, that's fine.
6,000.
It's still quite a few.
Yeah, and that's just plain math. That's
11,000 people in 20 years.
Yes, potential.
Potential.
Based on how you've grown historically.
Yep, exactly. So, thanks. I'm gonna concur that taking it back to the development committee is probably the right thing to do.
Yes, Kathy?
Typically, when we send something to a committee, especially something as important as this, it's usually done by motion.
Okay.
Make a motion to send it to Development Committee for Phase 2, if you wanna call it that.
Mr. Lee's made a motion, Mr. Walters made a second. Discussion? And roll.
Carter,
Yes.
Walther,
Yes?
Epperson,
Yes.
Barstow,
Yes.
Hampshire,
Yes.
Lee,
Yes.
Motion passes. Thank you, Kathy. That is an important decision. Thank you, sir.
I do have one follow-up to that, only because I'm anticipating a question that may come out of the development committee. Would we have any type of, the development committee, and I say we, because I'm on the development committee, but would there be any type of allowable budget to utilize OHM to come back to the development committee to help with this phase 2?
That's a good question.
I think that would be helpful, quite frankly, to be able to utilize that. One, to expedite it.
Yeah, we would have to appropriate that, so I mean, if you get some sort of, Chris, if you get some sort of, Jamie's not here, but, maybe what to do, we have to get some sort of, proposal, to continue to use them, we don't have to bid it out or anything like that, it's an ongoing relationship, so. But let us, you know, run that past Chris and Jamie, and they can bring it back in the form of a resolution.
Which hopefully you guys would help us.
Who would?
Okay. Thanks.
Want to close the project?
Right.
Thank you
Thank you.
for your
Thank you.
presentation.
Appreciate it.
And, Scott, I just have one quick thing for you. I don't think it's too far off topic. Do we have something on our graph or color-wise or whatever that shows farmland in perpetuity?
Yeah, there are three properties identified in here. We'll just need to more accurately reflect it on the map, so we can get that squared away.
Thank you. Anything else?
Well, are we making sure that those are the only, is there, I think what the mayor's question is, should have been, how can we identify the properties that are in the agricultural easement?
So identify all properties in the agricultural easements within the city of Pataska, and then we can have that reflected on the map.
Is there a way to do that? I don't know if we have to go to the auditor or.
I'm assuming it's be with, Department of Agriculture. Assuming that, I could look into it.
However.
I think our future maps need to show that, so that's no longer a question.
Right.
When we're looking at stuff, so. Anything else, folks? Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
Got a motion to adjourn by Mr. Lee, seconded by Mrs. Carter. Discussion? And roll.
Walter?
Yes.
Jefferson?
Yes.
Barstow?
Yes.
Hampshire?
Yes.
Lee?
Yes.
Carter? Yes.
Meeting adjourned.
Mike, those are all, that's why I said. You do every 5 years, all those.
I'm not usually.
Yeah, it's on,
That one was food.
yeah, it's,
I'm hiding everything.